Welcome, welcome good folk of Geelong and surrounds to the Alice Pung in conversation about her latest book, 100 Days, brought to you by Geelong Regional Library Corporation. I'm Bruno Lettieri. I hope you've got your mulled wine there. I hope you've got your cup of tea. I hope you're in the most relaxed chair you've got and surrounded by lovely people. The Geelong Regional Library Corporation acknowledges the Wadawurrung and the Eastern Ma original owners of the land on which our library services operate. We pay respect to the Wadawurrung and Eastern Ma elders past, present and emerging. We acknowledge and celebrate First Nations peoples of this land as custodians of learning, literacy, knowledge and story. Let me introduce our star attraction tonight. Alice Pung is a lawyer, journalist, author, interviewer, editor, mother of three, and husband and wife to Nick. She is the best-selling author of the memoir Unpolished and Her Father's Daughter, and the essay collection Close to Home, as well as the editor of the anthologies Growing Up Asian in Australia and My First Lesson. Her novel Lorinda won the Ethel Turner Prize at the 2016 New South Wales Premier's Literary Awards. Could you please give a tumultuous, exuberant, effervescent welcome to Alice Pung. Alice, there's thousands of people pushing into the studio. Can you feel them? They've all got their hands up and they're waving and they wish they could be amongst us. It's lovely to see you again.
Great to see you again, Bruno.
Congratulations on a superb book. It's out there in the world. You've had to let your baby go wandering into the universe and unaccompanied. Do you miss the live audiences, Alice? Do you miss the energy that an audience brings?
I do, but there's also some kind of different intimacy that a Zoom audience brings. And I've done Zoom sessions before where you disclose a lot more about yourself as an author and as a person, just because you feel like you are speaking more confessionally. You don't look around and you don't see a sea of, thousands or hundreds or, 25 people. I just see you.
So confessionally, do you find yourself even kind of surprised or even slightly alarmed that you've let out something that you think that shouldn't have got out there, but it's too late now and it's there?
Not really. I think I am more thoughtful because I'm by myself on Zoom, as opposed to whenever there's an audience with anyone, even if you're just in front of your dad or you're just in front of your kids, it's a live, it's another person. So you respond accordingly to their cues, whereas it's by Zoom. So it's almost like you get an obscured look into the way an author thinks and feels and talks. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I hadn't thought of the confessional thing. I remember speaking to John Clark once and he said conversations were intermural, and I'd never heard that phrase before. And I'm thinking of your confessional sense there, that sense in which the environment allows you to disclose and unfold in ways that you may not even been aware that you were going to.
Oh, it's a lot like the writing environment. I'm in this room that's too messy. I'm ashamed to even show it because it's where I work. And I was just, we're just talking about how we could hide desiccated bodies in here. No one find it's so messy. But because it's my writing space, I'm more at ease. A lot of writers are introverts. So when they speak to an audience of a large number, and introverts are quite interesting speakers because they save their best words for an audience, but there's a performative aspect to it, isn't there, that sometimes you don't get in your own room.
And Alice, I didn't declare to the audience that you and I know each other well, but we met after a conversation which was about Unpolished Gem all of 13 or 14 years ago. It's a long time. Is it hard to be in a conversation with someone who plays with your kids, who sees you in your tracky dacks on a Sunday, who sees you at your inglorious best? Or is there a sense in which the friendship maybe opens up pathways that a more anonymous interviewer may not get to?
Okay, so to our lovely Geelong audience out there, Bruno is actually a very dear person in our lives, you know, on a daily basis, by message, weekly basis. Hopefully, when restrictions had eased, we saw him every Sunday. He's the godfather of my children. So talking about this book, which is about parenthood, has been very illuminating for me as well. So you're in for a treat, and I do miss the live audience, to be honest. This has its own intimacy, but the live audience is something quite different altogether.
I miss just being a metre away from you and being able to kind of read some of the eye movement and knowing when you're confounded by one of my triple barrel questions or whatever. Alice, this is not a COVID book, even though it's set in a high-rise apartment and it's set on the 14th floor, and it's come out just after 4 kind of bouts of kind of COVID restrictions. This started way back when your family was a family of 3 and now it's a family of 5.
Yeah, it did, Bruno. So it started way back 4 years ago when my son was about 1.5. I had the idea for this book, a pregnant teenager, and I did the silly thing of having 3 kids in 5 years. So while this book was incubating, so was I. And it's not a COVID book. So 4 years ago, I thought, what is the most confining environment for a pregnant 16-year-old to be in? And I thought, well, she would be in 1987 when there's no internet, so no source of knowledge or expertise, no one to turn to. And she would be stuck on the 14th floor of this high-rise housing commission flat, because I'd grown up among those flats. My aunties lived there. One of our good friends, when he went to uni, he was studying his law degree, but he still lived in one of those high-rise commission flats, and it was an environment I knew very well.
Yeah. And interestingly, this is the first time I realised it was 1987, although that there's clues, aren't there? The price of stamps, and there's all these kinds of prices of things within your book that I had going, oh, that's of that time. But I'm glad you've kind of put it out there. The 100 Days, the title, what's the meaning? What's the significance? And how important, as a double barrel question, how important is the title, and how early does it come in terms of giving you a strong sense of where the story's going to go and what it's really going to be about?
Oh, Bruno, so the 100 days came quite early, and that gave me the whole scope of the book. So from beginning to end, the timeline is 100 days. And 100 days derives from a lot of East Asian cultures. After a woman gives birth, there is this period of confinement. For some, it's 30 days, for some, it's 60, and for some, it's 100 days. And this confinement comes, it's a historical practice. So 2,000 years ago in ancient China, women who gave birth, of course, lost a lot of blood. So they would be confined to their beds, and their mothers or their mother-in-laws, you know, this whole village of women would essentially look after them, bring them the baby only when the baby needed feedings, cook them foods that would warm their blood, including rice wine and things that are forbidden, you know, in Western culture, alcohol. And also she wouldn't be allowed to bathe for that period of confinement. Now that sounds disgusting, but there was a good reason for that scientifically back then. There were a lot of waterborne diseases. If you went outside in the middle of winter, you could freeze to death. So it was to help the mother recuperate and replenish before she could look after her baby. It was to make you the healthiest mother possible. Now, these practices are still being carried out. Yeah. And when I was researching this book, they were carried out in places like Singapore, in Australia, really hot climates in the middle of summer, where women were being told to wear woolen socks and turn off the air conditioners and not wash for 30 or 60 days, you know. And I read cases of women who, after confinement, finally got up out of bed and had a heart attack, like an aneurysm, and died because they'd been lying down for so long, you know. So it's this idea of cultural practices that are being practiced by well-intentioned women who just are not very educated, maybe illiterate. And what happens if you impose them on your child who is better educated than you, physically stronger, and you know, you think you know what's best. So that was what I was trying to explore in this book.
And as a writer, as you said, having a sense of the scope of the book, is that, are you going, wow, I kind of know the parameters here, rather than swimming endlessly into an ocean and I don't know where I'm going? I've got a perimeter to this. Is that helpful to you? Is that a moment where you go, yay, I can do this?
Oh, no, there's, Bruno, actually, I'll be completely honest. There's never a moment where I go, yay, I can do this, because I never write with this answer in mind. So some writers write because they found the answer to something, a real eureka moment, and they need to share it with the world. I never write like that. You know, I always have a question.
Alice?
Sorry?
You're searching for an answer.
I'm searching for an answer, and that's why I write, Bruno. And so it's an open-ended book. It is not without meaning, and I deliberately use that double negative there. But there is no clear-cut answer. And the question I was trying to explore, the question that gets at the heartbeat of this book is, how do you love your child, or how do we love our children when we are so flawed and anxious and so finite ourselves? And for some parents, they are all they have. So Karuna's mum is a single mum. She doesn't have a network of friends. She doesn't have anything resembling a friend except her employers, you know, which is a person who owns a Chinese Thai restaurant.
To a small extent, her friend from school, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Oh, sorry. Karuna has her friend from school. Yep. And her mother has her employers.
Very limited, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah. And what happens, just in terms of the mother figure, if you don't have people telling you how to mother, how do you do it? Or if you haven't been mothered properly, how do you not mess up your child? You know?
And I think I know what you're going to answer this with, Alice, but I'm, you know, I'd
tell
like to
me.
have a go. So you have this almost this unanswerable question which you're kind of wrestling with, that kind of feeds through the book, and yet you don't come to then at the end of it, you don't go, I'm a mother of 3 and now I've worked out how not to infantilize my children, how not to be overly protective. That's a lifelong thing, I expect.
Oh, that is a lifelong thing. Yeah, completely. And for every mother who's in the audience, or every father, because you're a father of 3, Bruno, you'd understand that you don't read a book or write a book and then come to the answers and become an automatically good parent. You know, it's an everyday practice.
Write a book that's figuring out something huge, Alice, and then at the end of it, you're saying it's still, in a sense, the ultimate answer is still elusive.
It is. And it's elusive, but I hope it's a humanizing book. And it's not culturally specific, even though the example I give is culturally specific. She's half Chinese Filipino and half, you know, Anglo-Australian. But the allegory, I guess, is my friend who went to uni and felt completely liberated because she could read a Harry Potter book. Whereas her mother had told her that was pure evil and was protecting her from all sorts of devilish things by restricting her literature and her interactions with the atheist world, you know, or the world of the occult. So, yeah, there are parallels between every kind of what we think we know best for our kids.
Some of those cultural practices you talked about just a few minutes ago were cultural practices that maybe your mother and father even practiced too. And
oh yeah, they were. Like when I was less than a month old, my mother told me this. She got a pair of nail scissors and cut off my eyelashes because she believes that if you cut off the eyelashes when they're a young baby, they'll grow back thicker and, you know, and longer obviously that's not scientific.
I'm trying to examine your eyelashes right now to see.
No, I barely have eyelashes. So anyhow, but that's a dangerous thing, putting nail scissors to a little, like an infant, a newborn's face for the sake of aesthetics. That's a silly and dangerous practice. But and the other thing is, when I brought my son to meet his great grandparents before they passed away, my mum's parents, my grandmother said to me, she said, oh, to recover quickly, get your mum to go out to the Chinese shop and buy you lots of rice wine. And my mum was scoffing at her, saying, Mum, we don't do these things anymore. That's peasants' way, you can't. And my grandmother had grown up, absolutely dirt poor. So if you lost a lot of blood, the only way to feel warm is to drink a lot of rice wine. It made sense. Yeah. But then my mother also did these practices on me, saying, you can't read books after you give birth, otherwise it would damage your liver. I'm like, what? Makes no sense.
Your book starts, Alice, in the prologue, and you use a prologue, chapters, epilogue kind of structure, don't you? It starts with, ever since your grandpa left, your grandma and I share the double bed. She says that she can't sleep by herself, that it's too dark, even though the hallway light shines on the stippled cement dots on our ceiling. It's like an asphalt galaxy up there, like the road is above us instead of 14 floors below. How important is the opening scene in storytelling? And when did you know you had that, or did you work in kind of reverse order, or did you get it later? But the opening, to get an opening and to get the journey moving must be a moment of kind of quiet triumph.
Oh, yeah. And I never know when I have the start of my book, because my books are character-based. So the start of the book can be any scene, out of the character's life. The most pivotal scenes in our life, and this isn't from me, it comes from an author named Jeanette Winterson. She says the most important moments in our life, we don't remember them chronologically. You might wake up one morning remembering your divorce, you wake up another morning remembering the death of your grandmother, or the death of your brother. It doesn't happen chronologically. So as an author, I chose this scene to begin my book, with Karuna and her mum sharing this great big double bed, because her mother's freshly divorced and using this young daughter as a crutch. And we do this sometimes to our children. We use them to save ourselves without realizing, and inadvertently giving them this responsibility. And that's not entirely made up, because one of my other best friends shared the same bed as her mother until she was married, until she was 25.
But it's also and the narrator is Karuna, who refers to her grandmother obviously in that way. But it's also about I've just lost my track of thought there. It's also about Karuna's mother kind of wanting to shield her from a world that is full of potential kind of evils and stumbling blocks and things that could really kind of hurt her daughter.
Oh, of course, the world is a rough place. And I wanted the contrast to be quite explicit, because a lot of people in Australia, especially new arrivals, especially refugees, come from places of absolute poverty, absolute destitution, absolute war. And to come to a place where we can cultivate the more genteel emotions, even I grew up not realizing that you shouldn't eat with your mouth open, little things like that, because my dad suffered starvation to the point you could feel his backbone through his stomach. Little things like that, I realized, gosh, so Karuna's mother comes from the Philippines, and she's one of the poor working class Chinese, and one of a family that had favoritism. And so she just has one daughter, so there's no danger of favoritism. The daughter is, Karuna, and she's the absolute favorite. And all she has to do is go to school and come home and do a light housework. How on earth can she get herself in trouble? So that's what immigrant parents don't understand about their kids.
how do you know that you're going to be a parent that doesn't do those things, or is there still a possibility that you might slide into an overprotectiveness, which is one of the great themes of the book, isn't it?
Oh, yeah, I don't know, to be honest, Bruno. I don't know for certain. And when you're at your most stressed, sometimes you parent exactly like your parents would. You revert to the same emotional responses. You know, your kid does something, you revert to yelling at them the exact same way your parents do. And it takes conscious effort to detangle, you know, a certain kind of upbringing you have. So I don't know. You know?
In Karuna's world, of course, the mother and the early bits of the dialogue in the book are very much the mother always telling Karuna things. There's never a moment of where something is being discussed. It's the mother's voice, which is the dominant voice, isn't it? What were you trying to achieve by doing a lot of that? The mother, you know, kind of showing her protectiveness through the dialogue and showing how she was disappointed that things hadn't turned out the way she would have liked.
Oh, Bruno, I'll be blunt here. The mother shows her protectiveness, but she also shows a lot of absolute control over that child, that poor 16-year-old who would be considered an adult in many places because she's pregnant. She's, you know, she's a child having a child. Realistically, that's the way a lot of our parents talk to us, and a lot of parents talk to their kids is they give orders, their kids obey, there is no discussion. And I think if you go back 50 years, maybe it's not just cultural to East or South Asian cultures, you know, that saying children should be seen and not heard. It harkens back to that.
But as the storyteller, Alice, aren't you, that must be difficult to sustain, because you would imagine that, you know, two characters in vibrant discussion would energize a story in a particular way, but to keep it so kind of where one of the characters is almost mute, we don't hear a lot from her, and so much of her reality is internal, isn't it? You know?
Yeah, and that's
a difficult storytelling thing to pull off.
Look, that's why, you know, many readers say, look, this book is so claustrophobic, this book is so, you know, gives me such anxiety, because she never exactly talks back to her mum, because it will result in more yelling and stuff. But you do get a rich sense of Karuna's internal life, and you get a sense that she's seething, she's angry. There is no omniscient narrator understanding with absolute compassion that this is a working class mother who's holding two very tenuous jobs and comes home and is, you know, very angry and agitated. You get a sense that this is a teenager at the cusp of her you know, burgeoning adulthood, at the cusp of her most attractive, and she's locked up and she's pregnant and she's fuming with rage and hormones. And it had to be from that teenager's perspective, although a lot of people might read it as a young adult book. It's probably more an adult book than anything else, because of the cursing in it as well.
and you didn't go for the omniscient narrator. You narrate through Karuna, don't you? Who's talking to her baby before her baby's even arrived, who's about to go into that.
Oh yeah. So Karuna is writing to her baby. That's this whole book, and that's because I wanted Karuna to have a co-conspirator against her very larger than life mother. So she's in. You know, she's in cahoots.
So the baby has been called into this co-conspiratorial role.
Yeah, and the baby is precisely this co-conspirator role, because her mother threatens Karuna that the only way she can keep the baby is if the mother raises the baby as her own and Karuna becomes the sister. And this is not an unrealistic scenario. One of the girls I went to school with, her mother gave her the very same ultimatum when she became pregnant in year 11. This isn't that far, you know, long ago. It was in the early 90s. So she raised that girl as her sister. I don't know what has happened now that there's internet and there's DNA testing, but it was a common thing.
you're a character-based writer, you keep telling us, and I hear the great underlying kind of thing is character is plot. If you know your character well, if you know the sequence, if you know the knotted bits, if you know the internal kind of conflict, then the story has enough propulsion to keep forward. Explain a little bit more of that for those people out there who may be writing and going, I can't get my character moving, I can't get it to go anywhere. How does that work, the character-based writing, and how do you cultivate it, and how do you get the character to reveal the fullness of her character to you as you're discovering her?
Oh, Bruno, that's an excellent question. And there's no magic formula, there's no magic tricks I can tell you, except your character has to be a real person. And what I mean by that is a lot of people take the lazy way out. They think, I'm going to create the best character ever. And especially in YA, like if you've got a young protagonist, you think, oh, I'm going to make this character quirky, woke, you know, she'll say funny, wisecracking things. Essentially, they make their teenagers like the character of Juno, if you've seen Juno in that film about teen pregnancy. And when you watch a film, it's completely different. She's funny, she's witty, she's wise, and she's a great character. On the page, it doesn't work so well because teenagers aren't full of wisecracking ways, especially when they're scared, anxious, young, and pregnant. So your character doesn't work if she or he is just an assemblage of quirks or cultural traits or, you know, feelings and emotions. You have to know someone so close to you in your life to be able to pull off a realistic character and to be able to care about them. I hope that makes some sense.
Sure.
Yeah, when people say,
"Oh,
you
in your writing room with massive sheets of paper on your walls, and you're going, as you're shopping, as you're doing something very domestic, as you're having a tip with your husband, are you going, I've got another paling on the fence of the complexity of my character here, or doesn't it work in that kind of way in which you need to put it out there?
Oh, no, Bruno. So I don't have whole wall charts with lists of character traits, eye color. Some people do that. Some authors do that. And that's how they build character. That's how they build it well. It's quite painstaking for me. That's why it takes, 4 years to write a book that's relatively short. It looks deceptive because the font is big, but it's quite a short book.
Sure.
Some people read it in one sitting. So my characters come through things they see, or things they say, or things other people do or say to them. So it's all verbs, it's all through action, and it's all through propelling the story forward. It's not through descriptions. I hope that makes sense, yeah?
It makes a lot of sense, yeah.
Yeah, that's how you know a human being. It's a mugshot if you do it the other way for me,
I didn't think actually you worked that way, but I had people, I was just wondering.
Oh no, I know authors who do that and do it well.
Someone, how you keep tabs of all the intricacies, the dialogue that's in her head, all of that. But I imagine, I don't know how my son builds beautiful furniture, makes those beautiful knots. So I suppose there's not an easy answer to the way in which you do that. But
and there's a lot of culling, Bruno. Sorry. So when I read over many drafts, and if the character says something that's too wise or too inauthentic, to her bumbling self as a teenager, or too sassy or too feisty, because there's this idea that if you're writing a young woman character, you've got to make her sassy, you've got to make her feisty in a very outwardly, almost cliched way. So when I found Karuna doing that, I thought, no, that's not true to her character. She can be, she can be fierce in a quiet and kind of sneaky way.
How does that manifest itself in the book? How does her quiet fierceness, as you put it, how does it show itself, and how do you write about quiet fierceness?
I don't know, maybe being an introvert myself, so you can be quietly fierce in other, in pretty severe ways, as you'll discover in the book when Karuna calls various authority figures on her own mother, you know, things like that.
Sure.
Instead of yelling back, refusing to do work as a good, you know, a good unionist employee would. She has no union. She's a single entity working for $5 a day at this hairdressing salon where her mother also works. So she does certain things to subvert and to get a sense of agency.
If you had to summarize Karuna in about 4 adjectives, what would you say?
Patient, quietly fierce, and stoic. I like that word.
Yeah. Steadfast.
Yes. I'm not sure she's steadfast.
No. Her mother steadfast?
In her beliefs, I guess. Yep. So. Yeah. Yeah, and in her love. Yep.
Yep. Even though the love seems to be a strangulating, claustrophobic, and at times quite a brutal love too.
Oh, brutal. I love that. Strangulating, brutal love. Oh, wow. Bruno, you've captured.
You're the writer. Alice, it's an ensemble book. It's a small cast, isn't it? There's Dr. Masano, who is a gynecologist that Karuna trusts. There's Mrs. Osman, who is the salon owner. It's a very small world, isn't it? Not only on the 14th floor, but also in the array of people that we even meet on the streets of their world. How does that kind of not limit the power of a book when you go so small with the casting, so to speak?
Oh, Bruno, it's really small, and the setting is smaller still. It's 2 locations, you know, and they're all indoor locations. Kind of like that author Murakami, where all his locations are set in institutions, schools and hospitals. Mine is only set in 2 places with 5 main characters. And when you have a book like that, your characters, each character has to work extra hard. You know, it's doing the work of 3 other people in an ordinary novel. And so I had to make sure that they were as authentic as possible and that they were as complex as possible.
Okay. So what's the authentic test? As you're writing, and I imagine that one does not sit with the little editor on your shoulder watching everything, but where's the moment where you go, I've got the authenticity right, I've got the tone right, I've got the language of the characters right, I've got the realness of their world real? How do you know those things, Alice?
Oh, Bruno, I never know. I never know until it goes out to the readers. And I'm very heartened because the reviews have come and some people believe that this book is about a mother's fierce yet overprotective, strangulating love for her child. And it's 50-50. And some readers say, where's the love in this book? There is no love. This is a book about emotional abuse. This is, you know, this is terrible what happens to this young 16-year-old. And I think, gosh, there's something that's happening that's right with these characters. If people read them in such different ways, right, yeah. There's a depth to them that is not 2-dimensional anymore.
Okay. But you're not conscious of trying to achieve that kind of binariness of where we're going to split our audience and have...
Oh, no, I never write in terms of good or bad. You don't.
David Malou says when we read, and that within a few pages, the reader trusts the writer. And he puts it down to the voice, the cadence. What do you think of that thesis, and how do you know when you found the right voice? And has this been a different storytelling voice than you've ever tried to write with before?
That's an interesting question, Bruno. I've never been asked that before. I guess every book is a different voice. This is Karuna's voice. What I found interesting when I did this voice was that Karuna, of course, fiercely and harshly, unrelentingly judges her mother and all her errors and all her ways. But as a writer, I try not to judge my characters. I hope that makes sense. Yeah, sure. So that you see everything through Karuna's eyes. And you're like, oh my gosh, this mother is so overbearing. but you also see through the mother's actions, the mother does everything for this child. So you're omniscient as a reader. I find that authors who write with a vendetta, and I've done a lot of writing workshops, and I went once to a regional town. 8 out of 10 of the workshop participants wanted to write about how pissed off they were because one of the family members had stolen the family farm. And these were like separate family farms, 6 or 7 different family farms. And I thought, wow, you can write that story, but the reader already knows where that story is going to go. And the reader already knows that there's going to be a good character and a bad character. And what's worse is the reader is smarter than you give them credit for. So they are not going to believe your voice because you're writing with a vendetta. Does that make sense?
It absolutely does.
Yeah. So you have to honor your reader as a writer, I think.
I think you revealed to me in other places, Alice, that you kind of, as much as you don't know so much about the book and so much is the evolution of the character as the story's unfolding, you knew the ending. Tell us about the paradox of knowing the ending, but it not surprising you as to the complexities of the character too, and not limiting that.
Oh, so I knew the ending, Bruno, just because I knew where my characters, their emotional arc, where they would end up, and the people who were pivotal to their lives, and the family unit that they'd formed. So that these things I knew. So in some way, when I got to the ending, it resolved itself. Okay. I hope that makes some sense to readers who've read the book. So, yeah.
There's an absence of men in the book, and I'm not saying that as a criticism, but you've got the father who's there early, the grandpa, Karuna's father, who she seems to have a lovely relationship with, but he goes missing. Was that a deliberate thing, Alice, to kind of go, I just want to explore this world of these kind of fiercely kind of independent women, and without, or did you just find the characters didn't have enough oomph in them to kind of go the journey almost?
So I wanted, of course, to explore this interesting relationship between Karuna and her, this zany mother of hers. I've got letters of complaint from school librarians about this mother and her use of language and things like, already. So, and I think, wow, that's interesting. Many migrant mothers use that kind of language with their kids every day. So you might want to check in with your, Sri Lankan, Chinese, Filipino students. If you think that's trauma, make sure they're okay.
My
mothers
mother
don't
would tell
understand.
it.
They're not educated. They're of a certain, working class, filthy mouth mentality. So you work that out with your students. Don't work it out with me. I'm just, but the father figure, some parents, I wanted to explore this other side of parenthood where some people, without lying, absolutely love their kids when they're kids, and they're innocent and they're vulnerable and you can control them and they think you're their role model. And once that child reaches their teenage years and you no longer can control them and they are almost your equal, and with some young men, they're stronger than you and they're smarter than you, then the parent has no idea what to do and either pisses off or fights with that child. So Karuna's dad's just pissed off. She has no idea what to do with a pregnant teenager. What is this? This is not what he signed up for.
And Ray, the young love of her life, she meets him in the homework club, and there's every sense that she's met someone with whom she's going to share an ability to explore her world deeply and to talk. And there's a great kind of closeness there. He doesn't last long either, does he?
No, but Karuna's, she's only 16, but some 16-year-olds have the sort of cynicism, which I hope some readers will pick up on. It's not a deliberate, swaggering, posturing cynicism. No. It's just a deeply embedded one because her dad left her. So why would this, young man who drives a silver Mercedes from the other side of town, who comes to tutor these dumbass kids in the commission flats, why would he hang around? She knows he's not going to hang around, so she wants to milk it for all it's worth. And in that way, I think she says, I'm not so similar, I'm not so different from my own mother. So if you grow up in the West of Footscray, and you grow up in a similar, some of the women, the young women, you know, your cousins, your sisters, might have had that kind of cynicism and that kind of responsibility. I think you know exactly what I'm talking about. Yeah,
I do indeed. Yeah. Ray introduces Karuna to poetry. He gives her a book of poetry, and the poetry gives Karuna a chance to go, wow, there is other ways of thinking that are not linear. Tell us about the introduction of the poetry and what it does for Karuna, and you start your book with an inscription of Walt Whitman's too. But tell us about, how does the poetry work within your novel 100 Days?
Oh, okay. So the poetry, as a lot of kids did back then, the library sometimes had a free book pile, you know, or 50 cents a book, and that's how I discovered Emily Dickinson and some other poets that, you know, I might otherwise not have discovered in my younger years until I went to a private school. And that's exactly what happens with Karuna. She gets handed a free book from a, you know, free books pile. And Walt Whitman is a great book for young burgeoning teenagers, because his ideas jump from place to place. They, you know, shimmy up mountains and skinny dip down lakes. That's the best way I can describe Whitman. Yeah. And that's exactly what happens to your mind when puberty happens. All your ideas explode. You know, you're like carrying too many trays at the same time. They drop. So that's what Karuna finds compelling about Whitman. And of course, Whitman is next to W. So there's a Sylvia, no, it's not Sylvia, she's American. There's a Judith Wright book next to Whitman. So that's how she discovers these two important poets in her life.
And you use the Walt Whitman quote from his poem, Songs of Myself, as the inscription at the start of the book. I celebrate myself from what I assume, you shall assume. For every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you. I think everyone of my generation knows that poem and adores Whitman's poetry. Tell us about the inscription there and what it means for you, and how it kind of maybe has some effect in the book.
Oh, Bruno, you probably could explain the poem better than I can. I came to Whitman organically, so it probably has a completely different context to yourself and some librarians and English teachers in this room. So forgive me if I've got it all wrong.
No, not at all.
That line, for every atom belonging to me as good as belongs to you, I think he might have been writing about the connectivity of the universe. But I thought, gosh, how does he know what it's like to have a child? How does he know what it's like to grow another person, and all your atoms merge until they don't anymore, and this newborn has come and they're completely separate entity from the moment they take their first breath? You're like, oh gosh, this isn't me. These aren't my atoms. This is a whole universe in itself. Yeah, so that's why that.
But does that poem speak to you? Did it speak to you as you were
carrying? It did. And you know what else spoke to me? There's this beautiful line in Whitman, I wait patiently like a noiseless, silent spider. And when I was cutting my baby's fingernails, I'm like, yes, I am that spider waiting patiently. So there's this thing in this modern politics where you can only identify with people who are similar to you. And I understand that, like, if you don't have Indigenous characters, an Indigenous person can't be a footballer. If you can't be what you can't see. But the fact that a Chinese Cambodian migrant child like myself could identify with this man who looks like he came from an insane asylum, who lived 200 years ago, speaks to the universality of literature. It's not, no one owns what you create. You know, I hope that makes sense.
Absolutely. And Alice, does it speak a little bit to your Buddhism, perhaps? Because I, rightly or wrongly, I see something very Eastern in those words too.
Yeah. So I'm Buddhist, and I've never felt. I mean, I get really happy when I see people, and some people get very angry about this. So when I see Western people like wearing Chinese, clothes or using chopsticks, because we were teased for these things as children. And so I understand people who say, well, you teased us and now you're you're making it cool when you victimized us for it. But I think some people do it as an homage to your culture. They do it because they respect and they love it. So Buddhism, there's no sense of ownership. I mean, there's no sense of ownership or theft of culture. But I don't speak for Indigenous Australians, because there is, of course, theft of culture
and of course,
there.
Karuna's name means compassion in a ancient Buddhist language, doesn't it? Tell us about, was that deliberate, or did the name just sing to you, or?
So I knew when I went on a Buddhist retreat many years ago, more than 15 years ago, I knew a Karuna, beautiful Eurasian girl in her 20s, and she said her name meant compassion. And she talked to me about money. She goes, oh, what's money? It's just a form of energy. You're exchanging energy. And if it's if you're exchanging negative energy, like if the money makes you more miserable, then that's not, you're not using it properly. And I thought, gosh, that I've never heard about it, that way before.
Wow.
Yeah.
Tell us about, we talked earlier about the fact that it wasn't a COVID book, and people must have thought, oh, high rise, 100 days. This is trying to talk to our COVID kind of sensibilities. I know it's not, but can I get some kind of sense of when you were in lockdowns? Do you think, as a reader, do you think you read differently? Was there something about being not allowed into that beautiful world out there, or not being able to move about as freely, and not having our friends and missing that? Do you think that reading assumed a greater importance for you, and do you think it might have for other people in that very stringent and very desolate times?
Oh, I think we were lucky, Bruno, you and I. So Bruno and I are writers, so we wrote letters to each other. Bruno's friends wrote letters to him, and I wrote letters to most of my friends, and that's how we kept in touch. And to be honest, COVID wasn't that unfamiliar to me, because I grew up in an ex-commission house in Braybrook, and my parents had very similar mentality to Karuna's parents, I wasn't allowed outdoors very much, like literally outside the house, just because it was dangerous out there. And it was literally dangerous because some idiot chucked a rock through our window and just stuff like that. People smashing broken glass down the streets and people honking at you, just horrible stuff because of the recession and because of racism, which I won't go into. So I lived a very interior life, and I lived very indoors for most of my 16 years growing up in Braybrook, in that house and in Footscray. So COVID wasn't terrible for me. In fact, it was an upgrade, because my parents had moved to a much nicer house that was a lot bigger,
And they were there to help with my kids too, didn't they?
Yeah. And I was still gainfully employed where I work at the Fair Work Commission 3 days a week. So it was not the worst thing to have happened. My dad said, look, the worst thing that could have happened is someone kills your family and, makes you work as a slave for 4 years. It's like, okay, I've got parents to put it in context too.
Alice, can I just welcome people who are out there to write some questions in if you'd like to go into our Q&A section, which is going to happen almost immediately. I probably should have said that at the start, but feel free. We'd welcome any questions. All you people down on the Bellarine Peninsula, or in Geelong, or even down at Lara, or in Werribee, or even in Clifton Hill, feel free to write a question. One of the loveliest scenes in your book that I got very emotional about, Alice, who was in Karuna's in the park, and we've already talked about the fact that there aren't many people, and she's not part of a world that does these celebrations and these communal kind of expressions of joy and exuberance. But they're in the park, these people, and they've got a bub, and they're throwing the bub around, and and they're really happy, and she's looking at it and she says, how can I compete? How can your grandma? There are only two of us, and much of the time we don't even like each other. But here we are waiting to bomb you with our flawed, anxious, inadequate love. I don't think I've ever seen a sentence with those three adjectives there together. It's an exquisite kind of question. Are you speaking for that little bit in all of us where we all feel that maybe we are presented with this child and all we can give it is our flawedness?
Oh, yes, that's spot on, Bruno. Our flawed, anxious, inadequate love. And the more people you have loving your child, the more perspective they have. And I grew up where my parents protected me against all odds and at all costs. So I was just bombarded with their overprotective and flawed love, not through any fault of their own. It was just that way because they survived a genocide and all sorts of terrible calamities in their lives. So their sense of danger was like a motion detector gone haywire that, senses motion with just the drop of rain instead of a criminal coming through. So that was their barometer for danger was really off, and they locked us up. And sometimes my mum would do things very similar to Karuna's mum, and she still does these things today because her mentality hasn't changed.
I'm coming to help out.
And as a mother myself, I just realize how lucky my kids are that I've got a wide network of friends and, a godfather like you, Bruno, so that they're not subject to my finite, flawed self all the time. I have no idea what I'd do if I was the only one responsible for my 3 kids. I think, gosh, what damage am I going to inflict on these poor kids if it's just me and them? And I mean well, and I mean, and I'm educated now in a good position, and I'm still shit scared. But I think the alternative is worse if I was absolutely sure of what I was doing as a parent. And that's the most dangerous form of parenting.
Absolutely, Alice. Just going back to your dad, and I still remember your book, Her Father's Daughter, and of course, one of the shimmering bits of that is where you go, the miracle is not that my father survived, but the miracle is that my father can love.
Yeah, that's true. So my father, he's always been a lot less severe than my mother, who grew up with many fears, maybe because of her gender as well. Yeah. He's lighthearted with us. He has never, in all my years, spoken a harsh word to us. Even when we're quite rude to him, he has not. Yeah, it's a miracle because people talk about their post-traumatic war traumatized dads drinking, becoming alcoholic and beating the crap out of them. My dad is not like that. So you can't rely on stereotypes, and people speak of very submissive Asian women, and my mum is not like that.
No.
So I'm still scared of her to this day.
She's got that fierce vitality we talk about.
She has the feral vitality that our friend Arnold Zabel.
It's a great phrase. God, I learned lots from you and talking to you.
Oh, no, that's from Arnold. So he talked about the men and women he grew up with who came out of those concentration camps. They had this crazy feral vitality about them. I know that.
I've loved it. And I keep looking, as I walk down the street, I keep trying to pick people with the feral vitality. So Jennifer, one of our audience members, Alice, has asked a question. So what's your writing schedule and how do you manage to juggle everything being domestic life, kids, working, because you do work as a lawyer 3 days a week. I know you're not working at the moment in that way, but how do you juggle everything, Alice?
Oh, so I'm on maternity leave at the moment. Oh, just with great difficulty, to be honest. It's ugly, the writing process. I don't burn candles and I don't have a special room. And if I was to take away this screen, this lovely pink, and you will see the sheer horrors behind us. but I prioritize the writing and the spending time with my kids. So our house is in shambles, and you know, if my grandmother were alive, she would be very disappointed, but she's not. So I do what works. And I write when I can, and I don't have a special book, and I don't have a special laptop. I have scraps of paper. I have things that look like this, you know. Sometimes I write on tough paper napkins if a sentence or phrase stands out, because otherwise there's no time. And then late at night, I try and collate them if I have 1 or 2 hours a week. And that's why the book took me 4 years. It's not that long a book.
You're a slow coach.
I'm a slow coach, yeah.
Well, I think you need to stop writing letters to me, and then you can just kind of zoom ahead.
Oh, no, Bruno, that's important writing, the letters and the diary, things that will never be published. That's what keeps me.
Yeah, I'd love
it's therapeutic, you know.
I could have a whole discussion just about that, but I've got a few comments that I'd love to read.
Sure.
We have an anonymous attendee. Hi, Alice. I have your book on order and can't wait to read it. I had quite a similar upbringing as you, particularly with having a complicated relationship with my mother. What advice would you have for dealing with moving on from the difficult experiences from childhood and the impacts it has on you as an adult? I'll let you answer that, and then she's got 2 other questions too.
Oh, okay. Thank you so much. And thank you for such a personal question. I haven't moved on from my mother, because she's very much part of my life, and she may have been a really tough mother to me, but she's a really great grandmother to my kids, which is something, if you ask me as a teenager, even as a 20-year-old, I think, oh no, what if my mother inflicts the same? And I would call it, you know, same bit of trauma on me, is because I love my mother a lot, and I can laugh about it now because I'm an adult. I'm 40 years old, and I have a lot of control over my life. But when she's angry, she goes absolutely apoplectic, and she'll yell things out. And once it was so funny, you know, in retrospect, she was yelling out to us, oh, the poor boy, yeah, blah, 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 blah. And my dad came home. I said, Dad, what was she yelling out? What does that word mean, pulbakia? And my dad starts laughing. And my dad says to my mum, do you know what you've just said? And my mum goes, what, fuck your gods, what did I just say? And, you know, my dad goes, pulbakia. And it means child of a prostitute. And my mum, she starts laughing, and that was funny. But when she's angry, I feel 16 again, and it's scary, you know, even as a 40-year-old. And I think that's just as a result of the way she was brought up, and the traumas she's been through in her life. So I'm lucky. I haven't been able to move on because I still love her. I can't cut her off or go cold turkey. She's important to me. But in terms of moving on from those experiences, to be honest, sometimes I don't. Sometimes she yells at me and I feel as angry as I did as a 16-year-old. And I sometimes, you know, my secret shame is sometimes I yell back because I'm an adult now, and it's not pleasant. And I'm remorseful always afterwards. And I think we both have an understanding that, you know, we pull each other's, you know, push each other's buttons. But she's really good with the grandkids. That's not to say she's changed her personality completely with the grandkids, but on a practical level, like the thing she does practically as a you know, as a grandmother, I think, gosh, she raised 4 kids in that tiny ex-housing commission house by herself when my dad was at work, when she was always in the back shed out working, I don't know how she did it, and I understand why she was so angry at us all the time. And I can feel compassion only because I'm at a distance. So distance helps as well. It helps you remember that you love the people you're pissed off at most of the time.
Alice, suddenly we've got a board full of questions. So I don't want to cut you short, but if you could just really try and have a quick go at some of these, okay?
Yeah, sure.
Merrin says, I've enjoyed your works and especially your talks at writers' festivals for years. Thank you, exclamation mark. You deal with suffering and the dark side of life so openly and with such compassion. Where does your optimism come from?
Oh, thank you so much, Merrin. I really appreciate that. And it's not like, I answer things honestly. So I don't believe it's a false optimism, because I wouldn't be happy if I was falsely optimistic. I think when you've seen some, and I have had, seen some dark things happen to myself and my own family, you have no choice to be optimistic, because to be otherwise would not be honouring the memory of people you loved. So I guess, and also for my children, I owe it to them to be happy, because I grew up with a deeply, deeply unhappy mother. And when your mother can't be happy herself, how do you learn how to be happy? I don't know. You learn it through the people around you. And I'm so lucky that my mother, even though she was deeply unhappy, she didn't have the power or resources to block me out from making my own friends or choosing my own path in life. So I was never able to repeat that cycle. I knew how to find happiness from healthy sources. So I'm just so lucky. I've got friends like Bruno in my life. Yeah, that's where and I derive great joy from writing. Like my friend Christos Tiolkas, if you've ever read his books and you've never met him, you think, oh man, what an angry, angry, angry gay man. But if you meet him in life, he's the jolliest person you've ever met, because all of his angst is purged through his writing. And when you meet him, he's just so well adjusted and so cheery. So some writers do that.
You're using our interviews to become well adjusted. I'm glad I have
guess so. Am I writing?
Utilitarian benefit.
I mean, some people don't say this stuff about their parents. They're scared because, and as a writer, I feel I owe it to say it in a work of fiction. My mother doesn't recognize herself in it. She doesn't think, you wrote about me. She's like, this Filipino mother's got nothing to do with me. They're Filipino. What would they know? Because the Chinese are also racist.
Good on you. Just very quickly, because we're running out of time. Beck says, I really enjoyed Lurinda, and I'm looking forward to reading 100 Days. I just bought it for our high school library in Geelong. So your first book has just been sold tonight, Alice. I know you've been waiting for that first sale, but it's come through.
Thank you. That's so lovely. But also the anonymous attendee who brought it because of the question about moving on from her own mother. It's a second book, isn't it?
Tell us where you can get the book. I know.
Sorry?
Tell us where we can buy the book.
Just any bookstore readings. You can buy online. Look for the cheapest one.
Have you ever found a bad bookshop, Jennifer says, looking forward to reading the book. Anonymous attendee says, hi, Alice. Thank you so much for a wonderful session. What's your writing schedule? I think, have we done that?
I think we've answered that. Thank you.
Some brutal honesty about some mothers, ! From Poppy. Beck says, I've got mine, I think, from Australian Standing Orders.
Oh, good-o.
And there's some great books
Beck.
Along to. And Alice, we're just going a little bit over time, but I'll just see if I've got a few more. Anonymous also, another anonymous person says, while this isn't strictly a YA book, I think it gives young adults a realistic but thoughtful perspective on the difficult job of parenting and the complexity of love.
Oh, thank you so much for that, because I've already received an email from a school librarian saying there's too much swearing and too much politically incorrect language in there, because Karuna's mother calls her, this is really awful, it calls her a retard in our language, which is this medieval dialect of Chinese, because she's got herself pregnant and she didn't tell her mum. And some mothers do speak like that to their children in another language. So where people are woke and politically correct in English, you've just got to realize that your students at the school where you order those books might come from cultures where they're still being spoken like that at home. And if you don't talk openly about these things, if you just condemn them, they're not going to understand that there's something with the language. And some of us are living in medieval world, some young people, and then they go to school and everyone's all woke. and it's a stigma for them.
And I don't know where I belong on that spectrum, but I'll think about it after this.
Yes, good on you.
Says, your honesty and humour is so refreshing.
Thank you.
Where does your humour come from, Alice?
Oh, I don't know. You're pretty funny, Bruno. My dad is funny. My mum's funny as well. When you know, sometimes intentionally funny, sometimes not. So yeah.
Alice, we're going to wind it up. We've had some lovely other comments too, and I reckon they might appear on the video when it's out. I hope so. Can I just end with one of my favourite quotes? Because you know I have to end with a favourite quote. Victor Surge. Writing should be a testimony to the vast flow of life through us. Do you think he's on the money?
Yes, yeah.
Does life flow through you with that vastness? Does it? Do you feel sometimes, wow, this aliveness is almost too alive to be kind of dealing with? Do you feel it? Overwhelmed at all sometimes?
Sometimes. I know what you mean, Bruno, and it's not, you know, the most refined literature that can do this to us, or the most verbose. Sometimes really simple literature does that to us as well, I think. Yeah.
And if you're in a dark place, Alice, will you reach for a book? Will you reach for a poem? Or will you go walking along the riverbanks? Where do you go first?
It depends what kind of dark place, and it depends what has happened. But, you know, Bruno has sustained me through many dark places by sending just the most appropriate poem for that moment. So thank you, Bruno. And for those of us who are letter writers out there, continue to write letters. It's really important, I think.
I'd like to do a whole session.
It's life-sustaining. Yeah.
Alice,
thank you so much, Bruno.
A bloody champion. It's a wonderful book. Please buy it at any good bookstop. Could we please thank the Geelong Library staff for putting this on? Libraries do change lives, and they've changed my life because they give me a lot of wonderful work. And Larissa says, I'm going to end with this. Thank you for the best book conversation I've been fortunate to listen to. And it's just scroll down. You are both fantastic. I can't wait to read your book. And please send me a letter. Now, that was my little bit to that. You're a champion. Thank you to Geelong Libraries. Thank you to everyone down on the Bellarine Peninsula. Go and feed those children, Alice. Good night.
Okay. Thank you, Bruno. Bye, everyone. Thank you.